Hello and welcome to the Arms Control Poser podcast. My name is William Alberque, Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. I will be your host as we explore the world of arms control. On each podcast, I will interview the great and the good of the arms control community about a current event related to a treaty or agreement, past, present, or only proposed. Then together we will go, hopefully, deep enough on the history and functioning of the agreement to help you make sense of it all. And, well, that's the idea anyway. This podcast is funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. Now let's get underway. Hello and welcome to the Arms Control Poser podcast. Today, special guest Leonardo Bandarra, the postdoctoral researcher at the University of Duisburg-Essen and the Vespotec Consortium. Welcome to the podcast, Leonardo.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's really good to be here.
I'm very glad to have you. And if you could first tell me, what is the Vespotec Consortium?
So, we are a consortium of three universities. The University of Duisburg-Essen, where I work, the University of Aachen, and the Research Center Jülich. And that's an interdisciplinary consortium working on nuclear verification. So we have people from political science, that's me, and some colleagues, sociology of knowledge, nuclear waste management, and physics.
Wow, that is fantastic. Well, thank you and welcome to the podcast today. And so today, what I want to talk about is, of course, we are now 50 years out from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, although we all know the lessons from the events of October 1962, what is really interesting to me is coming out of that, we had talks in Latin America and the Caribbean about a nuclear weapon-free zone. And even less known than that is other work across Latin America, including dialogue between Brazil and Argentina towards what we know as ABAC. And so what I wanted to talk to you about today is the region and what lessons can we learn from regional efforts across Latin America to limiting nuclear threats.
Yes. On that, Latin America is the first inhabited zone that's free of nuclear weapons by a treaty. So that's the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And before going into that, Latin America does not have many international conflicts, but there are some. So we had, for example, the Pacific War in the late 1800s, the Leticia War, the Chaco War, the Paraguay or Triple Alliance War, and there are still some border issues that are not solved. So the region came nuclear weapon-free zone is not something given. So that was the first thing that I would like to highlight. Also, the idea of why it became a nuclear weapon-free zone. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was really a trigger. And some say that it was a response to that. And to some extent, it really was. But the idea of nuclear weapon-free zones actually precede that. So we go in the late 50s. There was, for example, the ABAC plan for Europe. We got some discussions for Africa as well. And with Latin America, the first proposal actually came 1 month before the Cuban Missile Crisis exploded, and it was presented by Brazil. And ironically, it was only supported by Cuba. So at that time, countries were not, especially Latin American countries, were not so optimistic about the idea, and especially because there was also the perception that was widespread in the region that it was a nuclear umbrella under the Rio Pact, that is a military alliance with the United States from 1947. So this all changed with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when countries decided that a nuclear-free future would actually be more stable and better to the region. And then the negotiations were already discussed from 63, and they occurred in parallel with the NPT later.
So would you say, the Rapaki Plan, 1957, that was the former Polish minister
57.
1957, denuclearization of Central and Eastern Europe. at that time, of course, it was seen in the West as being a little bit of a cynical idea because, of course, they were uh, allied with the Soviet Union, which already had nuclear weapons at that point. But do you think there were certain conditions in the region that lent itself to nuclear-free discussions? Because, as you mentioned, it started before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Or did the Cuban Missile Crisis really, set the light underneath these negotiations?
The discussions were already held, especially in the United Nations, way before, and these
Mhm,
included other regions. As I said, there was also a proposal for Africa. There was also some initial talks that would later go to the Middle Eastern process. Uh, Even South Asia, there was also on proposal at some point, especially in the 70s. So the ideas were already there of denuclearization. That was the concept that was used back then.
mhm,
And Latin America was in the front of that because there was a call for peaceful uses of nuclear energy to be accessible, and also the relations with development. That is something that we should remember, that especially in the 50s and 60s, the idea that it was a very optimistic era about the prospects of nuclear energy, and those countries, especially from that region, especially the big ones, then I call Brazil and
mhm.
Mexico, wanted to have access to that.
And so that is was that the genesis of the Five Power Declaration?
Yes, the Five Power Declaration is what it would be later the proposal that would lead to Tlatelolco. So this
Okay.
was a proposal that was um, done before. So it was done after the Cuban crisis and after this change of perspectives regarding the possibilities of a nuclear weapon-free zone uh, against a nuclear umbrella. So they came especially in the middle of the 60s, 62, with this change of idea. And for that, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a turning point, especially among the countries from Central North America and the Caribbean.
And I know Brazil and Mexico were involved, but who are the other 3 of the 5?
Yes, so there were Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador.
Hmm,
So Argentina was not there. That's also important to highlight. Argentina is one of the laters that would come um, in, especially since 67, we had two groups that are roughly defined. So Brazil had a change of government in 64 for a
mhm,
military government,
mhm,
and that's also when some of the perspectives slightly changed. So slightly I say because the main ideas were kept, but that change of tone came.
mhm,
Especially with the relations with the peaceful nuclear explosions. That was an idea back then that nuclear explosive could also be used for other means, such as civil construction and other applications in engineering. So it changed after the military coup in 64 toward a more emphatic emphasis on those other possibilities, which would align to what Argentina had back then.
mhm.
So, but until that, and that was the sixth five power declaration, Brazil was still before that change. So it was also one of the sponsors of the Tlatelolco Treaty. And also important that the negotiations happened in Mexico, also because you see the role that Mexico also played back then. So the first proposal was Brazilian before the Cuban crisis, but after that, the negotiations in the second proposal had a very strong Mexican tone.
And this must have been a very complex idea as well, because as we know, the US, the UK, France, and even other European countries like the Netherlands have colonies or territories in the region. Um, so it makes it a little bit more complex in terms of how you define the area and how you implement. Isn't that right?
Yes, and I would go even further than that. I would say that Tlatelolco was all new back then. So
Mhm.
it was the first treaty that created a non-proliferation norm. So we have the NPT, but the NPT was open to signatures in 68. Tlatelolco is from 67.
Oh, wow.
So it was the one that preceded that with uh, legal norm that would ban the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And
Mhm.
by historians, you can look at the studies back then that non-proliferation was not a consensual concept as we have today. So some countries were not so fond of the idea.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying about countries in the region, but I'm also saying about other countries, also in Europe, in Asia, that would go for perspectives that you should not emphasize a lot this prohibition of other countries acquiring nuclear weapons. And yeah, so Tlatelolco established that concept to some extent. So the negotiations were also happening in Geneva for the NPT, but the one that came before was the one in Mexico, and also established other things as well. So it's only one of the field that defines what's a nuclear weapon. So in Article 5, this is a definition that may sound basic, but it's actually not so. It's also one of the countries with one really with universal ambition. So as you said, it also covers other countries that are not from the regions. In the first protocol, countries with territories in there. In the second protocol, all countries with nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapon states. So um, and it also creates other ideas that would come. So the idea of negative security assurances, for example,
Right.
and that is still today by, for example, by the NAM countries, the non-aligned movement is something that's always called upon in the NPT negotiations, but you don't really have a treaty for that, except by nuclear free zone treaties.
Right. And there's a couple other things that were part of the negotiations that weren't necessarily part of the NPT, in addition to negative security assurances. Isn't that right?
Yes. So when let's go back a little bit and see the intertwine between both.
Mhm.
So Brazil and Mexico were part of the 18 Nations Disarmament Committee. That was the United Nations committee that was called to negotiate the NPT.
Right.
And there were countries from all around the world over there, and they were negotiating a draft on the non-dissemination of nuclear weapons. So that was the concept that they used back then: dissemination and return to proliferation. And then there were, of course, negotiations, ideas that come from most countries. And some of them were not accepted and were not implemented in the NPT final text. Some, for example, the nexus between development, the access to technology, some ideas of controls, some ideas of, for example, funds that would come from disarmament, a timetable for disarmament. All those ideas, also victim assistance at some point was also raised, that were not included in the final text. And one of the reasons was basically because of the consensus of the two superpowers back then, the United States and the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
of a more, I'd not say basic, but a more clean text.
Right.
That it was not so much into the perception of other countries. And then I include Brazil and Mexico, who were playing both games at the time. So they were negotiating both in Mexico and in Geneva. So the 18 Nations Disarmament Commission was held in Geneva.
Mhm.
And once what they were asking for was not called in Geneva, they emphasized Mexico, and that's why both treaties had some. They
Right.
go on the same
Right.
topic, but with different approaches.
No, I think that's important. The other interesting thing for me is the creation of a permanent body for implementation.
Yes.
That's something that, yeah, the nuke weapon free zones. Can you tell me something about that organization?
Yes, so that's OPANAL, the Organization for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. So OPANAL is an organization that's charged of implementing the treaty. So the negotiations also were for had this question came. So who would implement that and who would ensure that the treaty is being followed by
Mhm.
the member states and also by the protocol member states? Uh, there was no organization back then. So no organization back then that would include all Latin American and Caribbean countries. There was the what would become the Organization of American States later, but it was not only for Latin American and Caribbean, it also included Canada and the United States, who were not part of the treaty. So the idea of Opanaul was associated also with making the treaty more viable. And since it was the first treaty that would create a nuclear weapon-free zones, it was also uh, aimed at dealing with the day-to-day basis of what that would entail, because it was something that was not clear at the time.
Mhm.
And until today, Opanaul has an important role in ensuring that the countries in the region speak on one tone, so to say, a minimum consensus, and that they also have similar positions with regards to topics on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation.
Can I ask you though, was there an ambition at the time that Opanaul would become something more like Euratom, would become
Mm.
more of, internal safeguards coordination and training and development, and so not just implementing the nuclear weapon free zone per se, but doing more in terms of cooperation in the region.
Also safeguards,
Yeah.
probably. So yes, Euratom is before everything of that. So Euratom is from 57 or 56, if I'm not mistaken. So it precedes the Latin American negotiations. And of course, it was also held as an idea of what could be achieved and what could be developed. So there were some proposals on the table back then. Uh, Verifications were not completely discarded. The
Mm.
countries thought, however, that would be better not to do that at the first point, especially because of the relations with other countries. So cooperations for acquisition of nuclear technology, for example, and also because of this idea that to develop broader ideas, broader technology. So this was something that was put on there. And interestingly enough, there was, especially in the 80s and 90s, some negotiations whether it about Opanaul should change their role and also include that, but there was no consensus on that
Mm.
either,
Mm.
especially for the countries that don't have nuclear technology. So that's also important to highlight, because Opanaul does not have only countries with nuclear technology, it has all countries that are part of Tlatelolco, and all of them do some kind of role as well.
Can you tell me how active is Opanaul today? Do they have annual meetings or biannual meetings, or do they meet every couple of years as part of the NPT process? What's the battle rhythm?
They have its own meetings. It's not associated with the NPT process.
Mm.
So they also do expert meetings. They also do some, they go around the countries as well with uh, part of the political process that it involves in preparations of the main forums. They are also part of other forums as well as observers. They are, for example, in the TPNW as observers. They are as well in the NPT as observers, and they also play this coordinating role. So also
Mm.
for coordination in nuclear crisis, for example. So if you scroll in the declarations of Opanaul, you see declarations, for example, during the North Korean tests, they make a statement on that, and also on regional issues. So one thing that came to my mind, that's something that's not well researched, and it's in 1982. That was when there was the Falklands Malvinas War.
Oh, yeah.
So, and this was a very interesting turning point when we come to the Brazilian-Argentinian relations. We'll go back to that, but that's one point that Opanaul also played a role, because some British submarines were sent to the islands, and some suspected, especially from intelligence in the Latin American countries, South American countries, that they could have been carrying nuclear warheads.
Mhm.
And this was presented at Opanaul, and which issued a declaration on that. And in the time, Puerto Rico as well, the United States were also accused of doing also having warheads transiting in the region of Puerto
Mm.
Rico, which was, both of them were not confirmed. The submarine was confirmed, but not the warheads in that. But there was a statement on that as well, and that also led to future negotiations with regional
Yeah,
implications.
I actually was reading a UK history of their atomic weapons program, and they actually said that they had to take special measures in terms of nuclear deployments during the Falklands conflict in order to comply with their obligations as an
Yes.
treaty, which I think is really interesting. That they actually that from their point of view, they actually had to change the way they approached the conflict in order to comply with the treaty, which is I think a good example of the effectiveness of the treaty.
hmm Yeah, it also shows the effectiveness of international law more generally, and that
Mm.
what kind of norms can affect and can have.
Well, now you mentioned as well Argentina, and I think one of the big conflicts that has sort of marked South American politics for decades was the conflict between Argentina and Brazil. And yet again, we have an example of an incredibly successful safeguards regime between the two countries. So, can you tell me anything about where that was born? What are the origins of ABAC? And yeah, what can you? I'm so curious about this organization. It just seems such an exciting development.
Yes, and that's also a unique kind of organization. I'd say that the only bilateral organization that conducts verifications, safeguards in all nuclear facilities in both countries. And just as a note, that's also the Brazil has also the only military facility that's under safeguards in Rio de Janeiro at Resende. So that's when the Brazilian submarine is being developed. So on that note, a bit on what's ABAC. So ABAC is a short for the Brazilian Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials. That's a very full name for with a nice acronym. And it already says in the name what it's for, and it also says a definition of verification on that. So it defines verification as accounting and control of nuclear materials, so what comes in and what comes out of a reactor. And it is something that was developed in a process of rapprochement. So, as you said, Brazil and Argentina had a long history of rivalry that dates back to the colonial times. So, Portugal and Spain also had some rivalry that was transferred to the colonies.
Mhm.
And when you have very fluid boundaries, especially during colonial times, let's remember that that Portugal and Spain were at some point a union, and that's when the situation got even messier in the colonies. Brazil expanded itself, and then by the time of the independencies, some of the issues were not well resolved. So,
Mhm.
and that's especially among the La Plata River in the south and in the region that's now Uruguay. So that was before a disputed region. It was part of Brazil before, and the part was disputed with Argentina as well. And both countries went to some wars with each other over border issues and other issues as well. Um, yeah, this lasted until the 70s, and I'd say until the 70s and 80s. So the last border issue was resolved in the 70s. In the late 70s, it was called the waterfall crisis. So it was both countries had many waterfalls and a huge hydroelectric potential, especially with the border with Paraguay, and both of them wanted each to build a hydropower plant with Paraguay. So, and the border was that. So, because the Brazilian plan would make the Argentinian plan inviable, and there was also some security issues that was related to that. They're not coming to that, but when they solved that issue, that was the last border issue that was resolved, and
Mhm.
then it came the Malvinas Falklands War in '82. And
Right.
the position of Brazil was also crucial in that. And that's from my own research perspective, that was a turning point because the Brazilian so-called positive neutrality, officially a neutral country, but in practice it was supporting Argentina. So, for example, it did not allow British airplanes to refuel in Brazil. It was also taking charge of the Argentinian diplomatic affairs in London. So, this kind
Mhm.
of positive neutrality also changed a little bit of the relations between both of them. And this all was kind of enshrined and in a new process that I started in the 80s already, and it led in the 90s with the real democratization, and especially with the first election of a direct president in Brazil in 1991, to a process that would go in a broad rapprochement in many different areas. So one of those was trade and integration. So we had Mercosur, which is the southern common market
Mhm.
in between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Venezuela is there but suspended. And we also had ABAC, which happened almost simultaneously, but a bit before. And the idea was to integrate both areas in nuclear non-proliferation issues and safeguards. It has basically two pillars, and I'm going to end with that. One of those is to create transparency between both countries by opening up all facilities. And the
Mhm.
second one was to integrate both countries with the international community by having an agreement that would also include the International Atomic Energy Agency.
We're going to take a quick pause here. When we come back, we'll continue the conversation with Leonardo Bandara. You are listening to the Arms Control Poser podcast. So this was part of, concurrent with political, economic, and security normalization of relations. But it's also notable, I think, if you just mention briefly, they both had nuclear weapons programs at some point, didn't they? Weren't they both, I think, in the 70s, seeking nuclear weapons? Is that right?
Yes, yes and no. So, yes, there were both of them had secret programs
Mhm.
for enrichment purpose, and they had programs in the case of Brazil, and that's the one that's more documented. The one in Argentina was, according to most sources, only really only for enrichment. There was, if there was something beyond that in the documents, there's still something to found. So
Okay.
researchers looking for a team that could be one. The archives is really good. And for the Brazilian process, it was a broad program. So it has over 5 parts that were directly, very diffusely by the three armed forces in coordination by the Nuclear National Energy Committee, CNEN. And one of those programs, that was the one by the air forces, had the study of broader technology, including laser, for example, technology, but also including peaceful nuclear explosions.
Hmm.
So this was the part that was associated with nuclear weapons. But then we can go back to the definition in Tlatelolco, and people from the time would argue that was not weapon seeking, but associated with this mindset of peaceful nuclear explosions. So it's a little bit more fuzzy than that. So yes, both of them had secret programs that were not safeguarded. Yes, both of them pursued technology through secretive means and hidden that from each other and from the world, but it was not necessarily looking at developing something to expose each other.
Right. So not necessarily a full-blown weapons program, but sort of taking those preliminary steps down the road, sort of hedging that
Yes.
could potentially, but also watching each other, watching other world developments. I mean, we have to recognize that in the 60s, you had nuclear weapons programs in countries like Switzerland and Sweden, and
Hmm.
later South Korea. So a lot of countries have explored these ideas, but essentially, again, when it came time for sort of the political and economic and security normalization between the countries, this was one of those areas because both countries had made the decision not to go nuclear, that
Hmm.
a good area for cooperation and to create a body to make that cooperation real.
Yes, and also to open up to each other. So there were also uh, many unsureness within both both ruling elites in both countries about what point the other was could go. So basically, they were not quite sure about each other's intentions. So taking that out of the game, so taking these last bits of unsureness out was also important in the broader rapprochement process for
Oh,
sure.
that's really interesting. So, I mean, I think that naturally brings me to the question of what are the big lessons? What are the top line lessons that the rest of the world could learn from the Latin American processes towards nonproliferation and disarmament? What are the lessons we can take away from all of this?
So there are many of them. So I would say basically three that came to my mind that are important. So the first one is trust.
Mhm.
So that's also related with my project with Investotech. Trust is broad, and trust is more of a feeling. So it goes more than confidence. So confidence is important, especially in techniques and in materials. So that's also why ABAC plays an important role. Uh, and but trust is also deeper than that. It's also related with images of each other. It's also related about making these images of enmity dissipate. So this is one part. The second one is creativity and out-box thinking. So with Tlatelolco, also with ABAC, and by the way, one thing that is also important I forgot is when countries created ABAC, the 60s and 70s, there were three countries with reservations to Tlatelolco. They
Hmm.
signed Tlatelolco and ratified with reservations. And those were exactly the three big countries in South America, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile.
Hmm.
And those reservations were withdrawn just some years after the creation of ABAC.
I see.
So those reservations were related with peaceful nuclear explosions.
Mhm.
So it was a very definition thing that was related with what they would consider a weapon device. And when they changed their mindsets on that definition and incorporated each other within each other in these programs and also with the international community, then they changed their reservations as well, withdrew them.
Wow, and ABAC
So,
played a role in that. So, and we'll talk
and
about that in a second.
exactly. Yeah, so yeah, the three lessons. So the first one is trust building. The second one is outbox thinking, which is something that's crucial. It's the idea that it's rarely one size fits all solution for international politics in general, I would say. So every kind of situation and region and context calls for the specificities also to be looked upon. And with the Latin American case, I think that becomes very clear. So Tlatelolco was also a solution that was not thought before, and it was implemented. ABAC as well, OPANAL as well. So the idea of thinking both creatively and also taking into consideration the interest and uh, the agency of the countries that are involved in the process. I think the only area where I can see that today is the Middle Eastern process with the weapons of mass destruction free zone. But besides that, some more creativity would be good in the international scene. Then the third one is that global politics does not occur in a vacuum, so it occurs within regions. And regions also do not occur in the vacuum, they also occur within global politics. So it's good to make the connections between both and see how do they relate and complement each other. As I said in the beginning, Tlatelolco had universalizing ambitions. It was not supposed to stop in the region and it happened simultaneously to global developments that were also noteworthy. So making this bridge is
Hmm.
also important.
I think that's really good. It's interesting too. I know you mentioned trust, and I always have an issue with that word because to me it's more about not that I don't like trust. Okay, I think trust is important, but uh, the way I would put it, it's the belief by the countries that they have a shared interest. And so if you're trusting, it's not that, Argentina and Brazil started to trust each other. It's actually they had some confidence that they had a shared interest. And once both sides had that confidence, and they were able to pursue it then through the politics and through economics and through security. That strikes me as being very, very powerful. And similarly with Tadaloko, all the countries in the region having a shared interest and believing that the other states in that region aren't going to undercut that shared interest, that that's a really important part. But ultimately, it's the safeguards part of ABAC that to me is really interesting, that they it, sure they believed each other had shared interests, but they also wanted to verify, and that verification was a really important part of potentially building real trust between the countries. But it starts off with that shared interest and verification, and then on from there. Is that it? Do you think that's a mischaracterization, or do you think that's okay?
I think actually does not goes against what definition I had. So basically, in the literature, there are many definitions of trust. It can be seen in many ways and in many languages, including my own. My mother tongue is Portuguese. There is no difference between trust and confidence. Both of them are called confiança. In German as well, Vertrauen. So it's I'd say that its interests are also part there. So one thing does not disconnect with others. So you have also this sense that you would trust each other, but you also have need ways to verify that, which in the end also say that you don't fully trust each other because there is always a possibility of betrayal. And this possibility of betrayal is what
Right.
is mitigated by verification.
Well, no, I good. I think we're completely in agreement there, and I think that's actually a great place to wrap up the conversation. I, I'm so grateful, honestly, Leonardo. I think I've learned so much from you in this, even though relatively brief, but wow,
Thank you.
and really, especially how Tlatelolco interacted with the broader global processes, and then ABAC as a sub-regional process, all supporting the same kind of outcome, and looking towards the lessons. Thank you for those, and thank you for talking about this topic with me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I was really happy to be here, and I hope that the listeners will have the same feeling as you had now.
Well, and of course, in the program notes, we'll have links to some interesting papers to help you understand these processes more, and the original documents as well. And with that, we end part one. In just a few minutes, we'll come back with part two, where I ask Leonardo about his life and times. Thanks for being here. All right, and we're back with part two of the Arms Control Poser podcast here with Leonardo Bandera today. And I wanted to ask you, Leonardo, so, obviously this is a relatively specialized topic. Can you tell me, is this something, arms control, nuclear weapons, are these issues that you've always studied? Is this something you knew from a very young age you wanted to get a part of? Or is this something that came later to you through your studies or through your work?
Depends on what you consider young. I mean, I would myself still consider a young person, but yes. I did international relations. I'm a Brazilian, so I was born and raised in Brasilia, which, for those that don't know, that's the capital of Brazil since the 1960. And I studied international relations there, both a bachelor and master. And especially in bachelor, I did a course on international security, which was interestingly enough one of those that I went the worst in my bachelor studies, but also the ones that sparkled more interest. And I thought, okay, so I could do something in the area. So I was already involved with research during my bachelor at a very young stage. So I had what they called scientific initiation scholarship in Brazil for doing research already from my third semester. And it was on a completely different topic. It was related with trade, mostly cacao, between Mercosur and the then European community.
Oh, wow.
Yes, but when I went to my master, I also wanted to do something that would be more interesting than cacao trade. So I was looking at international security topics and topics that could be interesting to research. And by suggestion of my supervisor, I was looking at broader topics, and then nuclear came into question, especially because I already had some good relations with people that were in the area, especially also related with ABAC. Uh, and then it was also the time when some documents were available as well on this part, and especially with the development in the late 80s, early 90s, that could be interesting to use. So I did my master uh, in nuclear cooperation and Brazilian nuclear policy.
Mm.
It was 199 pages long, so it was
Wow.
quite long for a master thesis. Then I finishing that, I did some months in Nepal working in an NGO in a completely different thing. Then I got my position in Germany. So I did my PhD at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. That's a think tank in Hamburg, also in association with the University of Göttingen. So, which was interestingly enough, one of the first places where nuclear fission was discovered.
Mhm.
So, and yes, so when I was finishing, I did that with the funding of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. So it was a fully funded
Oh,
program.
wow.
And in the end, by the end of the PhD, I got contact with people working at the Middle East Treaty Organization, where I'm a senior research associate now, working on the Middle Eastern process. So you already had your podcast with Hannah Nolte, so you already covered that a little bit, which is quite good. I recommended listening for those that are starting now. And I also got in contact also with the academic bubble here in Germany. I got close with Carmen, who is now my PI in the project. I applied for a position that uh, she uh, she put on the Vespotec consortium, and now I'm working in Duisburg, Essen, living in
Mm.
Cologne. Also, a hug for Carmen and Malte that convinced me to write you.
Well, so I have one question to round things out, and that is there any advice that you go back in time to any point in your life or career to give yourself that would help enhance what you've done so far in your career? Is there anything you'd go back in time and say, here's some solid advice for you, Leonardo, as you go through this career?
Well, actually, I would go for advice I'm trying to follow now especially in this year, which is chill a bit. Don't try too much because things usually they sort of yourself. Like especially when I see, like, for example, this position that I have now, it was also about timing of being in the right place in the right time with the right topic. And yes, so I would say that's advice.
That is great advice, and that's a great note to leave things on. Leonardo, thank you once again. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks for educating us, and thanks for sharing about your life. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you a lot, also from my part.
That's all we have time for today. My great thanks to Leonardo Bandera for being here today. I feel like I've learned quite a bit. Thanks, as always, to the EU Non-Proliferation Disarmament Consortium for funding the podcast. Thanks to B. Aubrey Freeman for the amazing music. My name's William Alberque, and you've been listening to the Arms Control Poser podcast.
I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again.